My name is Adnan, and the events I am about to recount took place roughly 6 years ago. It was a time in my life when practical responsibilities outweighed any room for superstition or fear. I was a government employee, and following a mandatory transfer, I found myself posted to a small, remote tehsil headquarters in the heart of the Punjab province. For any government servant, a transfer to a new district brings a unique set of logistical nightmares, and my experience was no different. For several agonizing months, my life was reduced to a chaotic cycle of temporary arrangements. I shuffled between cramped, overpriced rental rooms that smelled of damp concrete, transitional guest houses, and the hospitality of relatives which, no matter how well-intentioned, eventually begins to wear thin. After months of this exhausting uncertainty, the day finally arrived when my patience bore fruit. I was officially allotted a government quarter. In Pakistan, getting a government-issued house is considered a massive blessing, a financial relief that spares an employee from the crushing weight of monthly rent. I vividly remember walking into the administration office to collect the allocation papers. The senior clerk, a man whose face had grown indifferent after decades of repetitive paperwork, handed over the documents. He looked up at me, his voice carrying the flat, monotone drone typical of seasoned bureaucrats, and said in a casual tone, "The quarter is quite old, but it is government property, so it will save you a lot of money. There is just one thing. It is located in the very last row, right against the boundary of the old graveyard. If your family does not have an issue with that, you can take the keys." At that exact moment, the mention of the word graveyard did not trigger even a microscopic spark of apprehension in my mind. To a man who had spent months living out of suitcases, struggling to find a stable roof for his wife and young child, the clerk's warning felt like nothing more than a simple geographical descriptor. My mind processed it with complete pragmatism. To me, it was no different than someone saying the house was near a local high school, adjacent to a canal bank, or tucked neatly behind an old, bustling marketplace. When a human being is suppressed by the heavy, practical pressures of daily survival, earning a living, managing a family, and seeking stability, the mind tends to categorize ominous warnings as trivial details. It is only much later, in the quiet safety of hindsight, that one looks back and realizes those details were not minor at all. We simply choose to ignore the red flags because we are not mentally prepared to face the complications they might bring. My family was small and closely knit. My wife, Hira, was a woman of an exceptionally gentle disposition, soft-spoken and patient, yet possessing a deep sense of underlying intelligence and practicality. Together, we had one child, our 5-year-old son named Ayan. At 5, Ayan was at that beautiful, innocent age where the boundaries between reality, play, and imagination blur into one another. The administrative order stated that the keys to the quarter should have been handed over to us by noon. However, anyone who has ever dealt with government offices knows that official machinery moves at its own sluggish, unpredictable pace. By the time I completed the endless cycle of signing official undertakings, verifying the electricity meter readings, cross-checking the inventory list of old wooden furniture left behind by previous tenants, and officially notifying the colony's head watchman, the bright daylight had begun to fade. The heavy golden hues of late afternoon were rapidly giving way to the quiet approach of evening. Our modest worldly possessions were piled high in the back of a rented Mazda truck. It was the typical inventory of a small Pakistani family starting anew: 2 traditional woven charpai beds, a heavy steel almirah for clothes, a single large cotton mattress, a few boxes of essential kitchen utensils, cardboard cartons tightly packed with winter clothing, a small box containing Ayan's favorite plastic toys, and a compact, well-traveled refrigerator. By the time the truck finally rattled through the main gates of the government residential colony, the sun was hovering just above the horizon. It was the hour of Maghrib, that transitional time of day when the sky bleeds into a dusty, hazy shade of deep orange. As we passed through the initial streets of the colony, the atmosphere felt reassuringly alive and normal. In the first few blocks, groups of young children were running around in the streets, laughing and playing evening games. Through open windows, the familiar domestic whistle of pressure cookers signaled that dinners were being prepared, and on the rooftops, women were hurried by the fading light, gathering laundry from the clothing lines before darkness fell completely. However, as the truck continued to drive deeper into the estate, heading toward the final perimeter wall, a strange and palpable shift occurred. With every row of quarters we passed, the comforting, mundane sounds of human life began to thin out, dropping away like a dying echo. The laughter of the playing children faded into the distance, the domestic hum of television sets and kitchen activity vanished, and a vast, sprawling, heavy silence began to unfurl before us. Our assigned quarter was, quite literally, at the absolute end of the line. Beyond our plot, there was nothing but a crumbling, ancient wall built of weathered red bricks, and right across that fragile masonry lay the vast expanse of the old town graveyard. It was a wild, unkempt sanctuary of the dead, where ancient neem, thorny kikar, and sprawling shisham trees grew in completely chaotic, suffocating patterns. The wilderness had reclaimed the sacred ground. Peering over the wall, I could see that some of the graves were marked with solid, polished stone plaques, bearing the names of the deceased. Others had been reduced to simple, anonymous mounds of raised earth. A few graves were draped in faded green holy cloths, while others were adorned with withered, brittle flowers that had long lost their color. In many sections, there were just blank, silent patches of empty earth, featureless spaces that subtly hinted that someone had been laid to rest there long ago, but their memory, along with their name, had been entirely erased by the relentless march of time. Structurally, the quarter looked exactly like any other low-tier government building from the mid-20th century. It featured a small front veranda supported by concrete pillars, two main living rooms, a small central space meant to serve as a sitting area or dining room, a basic kitchen, a cramped washroom, and a narrow, rectangular backyard. The defining feature of this backyard was its rear boundary wall, which directly adjoined the ancient brick wall of the cemetery. The house itself bore the heavy scars of long-term neglect. The distemper paint on the exterior walls was peeling off in large, flaky patches, exposing the damp plaster underneath. The iron netting on the windows was heavily rusted, brittle to the touch, and choked with years of dust. The veranda corners were piled with small mounds of old, dried leaves and dark soil that had been swept there by the wind over seasons of abandonment. The moment I inserted the heavy iron key into the front door and pushed it open, a thick, stagnant wave of air rushed out to greet us. It was that unmistakable, heavy odor unique to houses that have been sealed shut for years. A complex blend of deep moisture, alkaline white lime paint, decaying old wood, trapped stale air, the faint chemical tang of old kerosene oil, and the ghostly, lingering residue of a cheap incense stick burned by a tenant long since gone. The official watchman of the government colony, an elderly, weathered man named Ghulam Rassel, had walked alongside the truck to guide us to the location. He handed the keys over to me, his calloused hands brushing against mine. But the moment he stepped across the threshold into the dark interior of the house, his posture shifted. He instinctively cast a quick, calculated look toward the back of the property, towards the rear courtyard. He cleared his throat with a sharp, heavy cough, a nervous gesture that immediately gave me the impression that he was actively holding back a thought, anchoring a heavy secret deep within his chest. Trying to break the sudden ice, I asked him standard questions about the utilities, inquiring whether the water supply was functional and if the electrical wiring was stable. Ghulam Rassel nodded quickly, providing short, practiced answers to reassure me. But the moment Hira stepped further into the house and pointed toward the rear of the structure, asking, "Where does that particular door lead?" the watchman froze, falling completely silent for several tense seconds. In the back wall of the courtyard, Set directly into the brickwork that separated the house from the dead, stood a small, solid iron door. It was visibly ancient, its surface deeply pitted with dark rust and coated with layers of grime. From our side, the door was secured by a thick, heavy iron latch that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. Beyond that door, hidden from our view, lay the narrow dirt pathways and walkways of the old cemetery. Ghulam Rassel quickly shifted his weight, his voice rising slightly as he tried to dismiss her question. "That door is completely out of use, Bibi," he said, addressing Hira with a polite but forced casualness. "In the old days, many decades ago, perhaps the colony gardeners or the municipal cleaning staff used it to pass back and forth between the grounds. Now, it remains permanently locked from the inside. You should just make sure never to open it. It opens directly into the graveyard, so it is best to keep the young child from wandering anywhere near that side." His tone carried the weight of a serious warning, but it lacked the standard, polite caution that a regular government employee offers to new residents. There was an undercurrent of urgency in his delivery, a quiet, desperate desire to cut the conversation short and bury the topic right then and there. He then stepped closer to me, leaning in slightly, and spoke in a significantly lower, gravelly whisper. "Sahib, this house is very old. If during the dead of the night you happen to hear any strange sounds coming from the rear courtyard, do not rush to open that door to investigate. Sometimes wild alley cats roam the walls, sometimes the wind rattles the old tin sheets on the roofs, and occasionally people from the town come to the graveyard late at night to offer prayers for their deceased relatives. But no matter what happens or what you think you hear in the dark, check the front of the house first. Leave that back door completely alone." At that moment, I dismissed his words as the typical, harmless eccentricities of an aging employee who had spent too many years working near a cemetery. I simply nodded my head to placate him. But Hira, who was standing just a few feet away, shot me a sharp, searching look. Her eyes were filled with an intense unspoken question mixed with a clear wave of displeasure. It was the look a wife gives her husband when she realizes an unpleasant truth has been withheld from her. She was demanding to know why I hadn't informed her that our new home shared a literal wall with a massive, ancient graveyard. Sensing the tension and wanting to keep the mood light in front of the laborers who were actively unloading our furniture from the truck, I offered a forced, reassuring smile. I spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, saying, "The graveyard is completely restricted to the other side of that thick wall. The house is on this side, and in this day and age, being allocated a rent-free government quarter is an absolute blessing." Hira chose not to argue or reply, remaining completely silent. But having been married to her for years, I knew her silence meant she had buried the anxiety deep in her heart, locking it away to process later. As the laborers carried the last of our heavy boxes and beds inside, the darkness of night descended upon the colony with absolute finality. The workers, eager to leave the isolated edge of the estate before the pitch black set in, collected their wages and departed in a hurry. Ghulam Rassel also took his leave, informing us that if we required any urgent assistance during the night, his small quarters were located just a short distance away in the street directly opposite the main block. But as the old watchman turned on his heel to walk away, he paused for a brief, haunting second to look back at the dark rear courtyard one last time. There was something so intensely grim and deliberate in that final glance that it acted like a cold, microscopic needle, piercing through my armor of rationality and implanting the first genuine seed of unease deep within my chest. Suddenly, the world contracted, and the three of us were left entirely alone inside the vast, hollow echo of the old house. Desperate to create a sense of normalcy, Hira immediately went to work in the kitchen, wiping down the concrete counters to prepare a space for cooking. I walked through the rooms, testing the old electrical switches and checking the light bulbs. Our son, Ayan, unpacked a small bag of his favorite plastic toys and sat quietly in the center of the large living room, arranging them in neat lines on the floor. As we moved about, the sounds of our sudden presence, the scraping of furniture, our footsteps, our voices, began to bounce off the walls, highlighting just how empty the space really was. The rooms were designed with unusually high, cavernous ceilings that seemed to swallow the light. The old ceiling fans were thick with layers of dark, greasy dust, and the plaster on the walls was scarred with countless holes from rusty nails driven into them by previous, long-forgotten occupants. In the corner of the main bedroom, a massive, distorted water stain stretched from the ceiling down to the floor. The dampness had caused the paint to bubble and discolor into a grotesque shape that, if looked at from a certain angle in the dim light, bore an unsettling resemblance to a human face tilted downward in deep, perpetual sorrow. Furthermore, the glass panes on the window facing the rear courtyard were so heavily scratched, stained, and clouded with age that they completely distorted the view. It was impossible to see the outside clearly. The world beyond the glass was reduced to shifting, abstract shapes and dark shadows. By the time the night prayers of Isha had concluded, we had only unpacked the absolute essentials. Hira managed to light the old gas stove and brewed a strong, hot pot of tea. I unwrapped the flat rotis and the chicken gravy we had purchased from a roadside dhaba on our way here. Ayan had been completely engrossed in his toys for the past hour, but suddenly he stopped playing. He left his plastic figures on the floor, stood up, and walked directly over to the clouded glass window that looked out into the back courtyard. Outside, a single, low-wattage yellow bulb hung from a frayed wire on the veranda, casting a weak, trembling circle of light over the brick floor. Beyond that meager light, the tall trees of the graveyard loomed over the wall, their thick branches swaying slowly like massive, reaching arms against the dark sky. Ayan stood perfectly still, his small face pressed close to the glass, staring intently into the courtyard. I called out to him, my voice warm and cheerful, "Ayan, come over here, beta. The food is getting cold, come eat your dinner." The boy did not move. He remained frozen for several long seconds, staring into the dark. Then, without turning his head, he spoke in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone that lacked any childish innocence. "Baba, why is that uncle standing out there?" A cold prickle of alertness hit my spine. I immediately stood up from the floor, walked over to the window, and stood right behind him, peering through the glass. The small courtyard was completely empty. The weak yellow light illuminated nothing but bare bricks. Beyond the boundary wall, the dark silhouettes of the cemetery trees moved against the night sky, and I could catch the faint, uneven outlines of a few old graves beneath the foliage. The wind was causing the leaves to rustle, but there was absolutely no one there. There was no man. I placed a reassuring hand on Ayan's head, gently stroking his hair, and said, "There is no one out there, beta. It is just a shadow from the trees. Look at how the branches are moving in the wind." But my son did not look up at me. He kept his eyes locked on the dark space outside and whispered, "He wasn't standing over by the wall, Baba. He was standing right inside our courtyard, right under the light." Hira's face turned pale in an instant. She quickly stepped forward, grabbed Ayan by his shoulders, and pulled him away from the window, pulling him close to her side. She immediately shifted his attention back to the food, speaking to him in a hurried, cheerful voice to distract his young mind. I stood by the window for another minute, a heavy feeling settling in my stomach. For a brief second, I felt an intense, overwhelming urge to unpack one of the large cartons right away, find a thick sheet of fabric, and nail it across the window to block out the view of the backyard completely. But our bodies were deeply exhausted from the grueling move, and the sheer physical fatigue made even the smallest task feel like an insurmountable mountain. By 10:30 p.m., we had managed to bring some semblance of order to the main bedroom. We unrolled the large cotton mattress directly onto the floor for Hira and myself, and right next to us, we set up a small, comfortable floor bed for Ayan. Hira unpacked a change of clothes for the morning, and I went around the house one final time, performing a meticulous security check on every entry point. The heavy front door was locked and bolted. The wooden door leading to the rear courtyard was securely latched. I walked out into the small back space to verify the old iron graveyard door. Its heavy lock was solid and completely immovable. Finally, I checked the small kitchen window, ensuring the iron latch was firmly in place. Beyond the house, the graveyard was swallowed by an absolute, suffocating darkness. There were no streetlights, no signs of life. Only occasionally, the distant, weak glint of a light from a faraway main road would filter through the thick canopy of trees, looking like a dying star. We turned off the main light, leaving only a tiny, dim night lamp running in the corner of the bedroom. Exhausted from the day's physical labor, Ayan fell into a deep sleep almost immediately, his breathing rhythmic and peaceful. Hira lay awake on the mattress, staring up at the high ceiling. After a long silence, she turned her head toward me and spoke in a tight whisper. "Adnan, I do not like this house at all. There is an incredibly strange, suffocating heaviness in the air here." I reached out, taking her hand in mine, and tried to offer comfort using logical arguments. "Every house that has been locked away from the world feels strange on the very first day, Hira," I explained softly. "Tomorrow, we will clean the place thoroughly. We will hang up the curtains, unpack our things, and once we introduce ourselves to the neighbors in the front rows, everything will feel perfectly normal. Don't worry." But deep within the silent recesses of my own mind, I knew I was lying to her. I knew that the oppressive weight hanging over the rooms was not merely the result of dust, stale air, or abandonment. There was a distinct, stagnant presence in the structure, a cold, patient quality that didn't seem to care about human intrusion. It felt like an entity that wasn't bothered by our noise, but was instead quietly waiting, biding its time, counting down the minutes until we finally closed our eyes and surrendered to the vulnerability of sleep. It was shortly after 11:00 p.m. when the very first sound broke the silence. The noise was incredibly faint, almost imperceptible to an untrained ear. It sounded exactly like the distinct, crisp crunch of someone taking a slow, deliberate step over dry, brittle leaves in the rear courtyard. I immediately froze, rolling over onto my side, straining my ears to listen. The sound did not repeat. For a couple of minutes, the vast, heavy silence returned, thick and unbroken. But then the sound returned. This time, it was louder, sharper, and noticeably prolonged. It was a continuous, dragging rustle, exactly like the sound of a body moving slowly along the rough brick surface of the rear wall, scraping against the masonry before coming to a sudden, dead stop right outside our bedroom window. I sat up straight on the mattress, my heart taking a sudden leap in my chest. Beside me, Hira opened her eyes. She had been awake the entire time, listening to the dark. Without turning her head to look at me, she asked in a trembling, barely audible whisper, "Did you hear that too?" Trying to keep my voice steady, though a cold layer of sweat was already forming on my palms, I replied, "It's probably just a stray cat that climbed over the wall." But there was absolutely no conviction in my voice, and Hira knew it. I reached over, grabbed my mobile phone, turned on the bright LED torch, and walked out into the central space toward the wooden door of the backyard. The heavy iron bolt was exactly as I had left it, locked tight from the inside. I then stepped into the dark kitchen, walked over to the window, and shone the bright beam of the torch through the clouded glass pane, sweeping the light across the small brick courtyard. The courtyard was completely empty. There was no physical intruder, no animal, no movement. But as the beam of my torch swept across the ground, a specific detail caught my attention, causing my breath to catch in my throat. When we had unloaded our possessions earlier that evening, the autumn wind had left a thick, completely random scattering of dry leaves across the brick floor of the yard. They had been distributed in uneven mounds everywhere. But now, as I looked through the glass, I saw a clear, distinct line slicing through the foliage. Moving directly from the ancient iron graveyard door all the way across the yard toward our bedroom window, the dry leaves had been parted. It was a narrow, clean pathway, exactly as if someone had walked through the debris with agonizing slowness, gently brushing the leaves aside to the left and right with their feet as they walked. I stood there in the dark kitchen, my mind desperately scrambling to construct a logical explanation. I told myself that a sudden, sharp draft of wind could have blown through the yard and cleared the leaves in that exact pattern. But even as that thought formed, my rational mind rejected it. The courtyard was deeply enclosed by high brick walls on all four sides, creating a shielded pocket. There was no strong wind tonight. The air outside was almost entirely still. I slowly walked back into the bedroom and lay down. Beside us, Ayan was tossing and turning restlessly in his sleep, his small body shifting uncomfortably on his bed. Hira leaned over, gently placing her hand on his forehead to calm him down, and that universal, intense expression of maternal anxiety washed over her face, the look of a mother who instinctively senses a hidden danger threatening her child. Ayan's eyes remained tightly closed, sealed in the grip of a deep sleep, but his small lips had begun to move, twitching nervously as he whispered words into the silence of the room. Hira leaned in closer, pressing her ear near his mouth to catch the muffled sounds. The moment she heard what he was saying, the expression on her face changed completely, twisting into a mask of pure terror. I leaned forward, my pulse racing, and whispered, "What is he saying, Hira? What is it?" Hira slowly raised her head, her eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears, and whispered in a shaking voice, "He keeps repeating, 'I won't come out. My mama will scold me.'" Before I could even form a response to those chilling words, Ayan's lips moved again. Without opening his eyes, his voice clear and perfectly audible in the quiet room, he uttered another sentence. "You should open the door yourself. I am too small." Hira couldn't take it anymore. Panicking, she immediately grabbed Ayan by his arms and shook him awake, desperate to pull him out of whatever nightmare had gripped his mind. Ayan snapped his eyes open. For several terrifying moments, he just sat there on the bed, staring blankly at the two of us with completely vacant eyes, as if his consciousness was trapped in a completely different space, unable to comprehend where he was or who we were. Then, suddenly, he burst into a loud, frantic fit of crying. We held him close, wrapping our arms around him, and desperately asked him what he had seen in his dream. At first, his small chest heaved with heavy sobs and he refused to speak. Then he reached out, burying his face into my neck, gripping my shirt tightly with his small hands, and sobbed, "That little boy outside. He was calling me. He was telling me to come out and play with him. He said he has a house made of mud over there." The moment those words left his mouth, Hira immediately began reciting verses of the holy Kalima under her breath, her voice trembling as she rocked our son in her arms. This time, I did not attempt to dismiss the boy's words as a simple, overactive imagination or a passing nightmare. I couldn't, because the specific sentence Ayan had uttered in his sleep, "You should open the door yourself. I am too small, had become lodged deep within my mind like a jagged shard of ice. It was a direct, horrifying echo of the watchman's warning. Someone or something was standing at that locked door, asking our child to unlatch it from the inside. The remainder of that first night passed in a state of exhausting, suffocating vigilance. Neither Hira nor I could close our eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. Every time the old wooden structures of the quarter settled with a faint creak, or the autumn wind caused the heavy branches of the kikar trees over the graveyard wall to brush against the brickwork, our bodies would stiffen instantly. We sat in the dim glow of the small night lamp, holding Ayan between us. By the time the first pale, gray light of dawn began to filter through the clouded glass windows, the immediate, paralyzing terror of the darkness receded slightly, replaced by the heavy, throbbing ache of sheer physical and mental exhaustion. When the sun finally rose, casting a bright, normal daylight over the property, the house looked different. The terrifying shadows that had distorted the rooms during the night were gone, replaced by the mundane sight of unpacked cardboard boxes and dusty tiled floors. I tried to use the bright morning light to restore a sense of logic and comfort to the household. I stood in the kitchen, making a fresh pot of tea, and spoke to Hira in a firm, confident voice. I argued that a child's mind is highly sensitive to a new environment, and that Ayan's nightmare was simply the result of hearing the old watchman talk about the graveyard right before bedtime. Hira did not argue with my reasoning, but the dark, heavy circles under her eyes and the tight, anxious line of her mouth told me that her maternal instincts were not convinced. She remained quiet, moving through the rooms with a heavy, cautious step, never letting Ayan leave her sight for even a single moment. Determined to break the oppressive atmosphere, I spent the afternoon actively working around the house. I unpacked the large boxes, arranged the heavy steel almirah against the bedroom wall, and spent over an hour thoroughly scrubbing the dust and grime off the windows. I took a thick, dark bedsheet and securely nailed it across the glass window that faced the rear courtyard, completely blocking the view of the cemetery. I told myself I was doing this to prevent the bright sun from heating up the room, but deep down, I knew the truth. I couldn't bear the thought of Ayan standing at that glass again, looking out into the empty yard. By the evening, the physical layout of our home looked clean and organized. But as the sun began its rapid descent toward the horizon, bringing back that dusty, orange haze of twilight, the familiar, icy grip of anxiety returned to the house. The high ceiling seemed to darken first, swallowing the artificial light from our bulbs. It was during the hour of Maghrib when the first truly inexplicable event occurred. Hira was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and I was in the main room, checking the locks on the front door. Ayan was sitting on the carpet, quietly rolling a small plastic car back and forth. Suddenly, the distinct metallic sound of a heavy latch sliding open echoed through the house. It was a sharp, grating noise, the unmistakable sound of old, rusted iron moving against iron. The sound had come directly from the rear of the property. I froze instantly, my hand resting on the front door bolt. From the kitchen, the sound of Hira's chopping stopped dead. A heavy, absolute silence descended upon the rooms for 3 long seconds. Then, a sudden, violent draft of freezing cold air rushed through the central hallway. It wasn't the warm, dusty evening breeze of the Punjab plains. It was an unnaturally icy, damp draft that carried the distinct, unmistakable smell of freshly turned earth, wet rotting leaves, and the heavy, ancient scent of old graves. I hurried toward the back of the house, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. Hira emerged from the kitchen at the exact same moment, her face completely drained of color, holding a kitchen knife tightly in her trembling hand. Together, we walked into the central space and looked toward the wooden door that led to the rear courtyard. The heavy wooden door, which I had personally latched and checked just an hour prior, was swinging wide open, creaking softly as it moved on its old hinges. The wind was completely still outside. Through the open doorway, I could see the small brick courtyard, lit by the weak yellow bulb. My eyes moved instinctively toward the back wall, toward the ancient iron door that opened directly into the graveyard. My breath caught in my throat. The thick, heavy iron latch on that graveyard door, which had been covered in decades of solid rust and grime, was now pulled completely back. The ancient door was slightly ajar, resting open by a few inches, revealing a vertical strip of pitch-black darkness from the cemetery beyond. A wave of pure, animal panic washed over me, but my rational mind desperately fought to take control. I grabbed a heavy wooden stick that was leaning against the wall, stepped out onto the cold bricks of the courtyard and shouted into the dark, asking if someone was out there. There was no answer. The silence of the graveyard was absolute, heavy and unbroken. I approached the iron door with cautious steps, my phone torch cutting through the gloom. I pushed the heavy iron door shut. It felt incredibly heavy, as if the metal itself was resisting my touch. I slammed the latch back into place, forcing it into the rusted catch with all my strength, and then went back inside, locking the wooden courtyard door behind me and throwing the secondary security bolt. When I walked back into the living room, Ayan was no longer sitting on the carpet playing with his car. He had stood up and was walking slowly toward the blocked bedroom window. He reached out with his small hand, gently pulling at the corner of the nailed bedsheet, trying to peer through the glass into the dark yard. Hira rushed forward, dropping the kitchen knife onto the floor with a loud clatter. She grabbed Ayan, pulling him tightly into her lap, and began to cry silently, her body shaking with heavy, uncontrollable sobs. "Adnan, please," she begged, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. "Let us leave this place tonight. We can sleep in a hotel, we can go to a railway station waiting room, we can sleep on the floor of your office. Just take us away from this house." I sat down next to her, wrapping my arms around both of my family members. I wanted to tell her that we could leave right away, but the stark, practical realities of my life held me back. It was nearly 9 o'clock at night. The government colony was isolated, located at the very edge of a remote town where transportation vanished after dark. I didn't own a car, and the thought of walking down the dark, unlit roads of the Tehsil with a young child and a panicked wife felt equally dangerous. I had to be the anchor. I had to maintain an illusion of safety. I forced my voice to sound calm, adopting a gentle, authoritative tone. "Hira, listen to me," I said, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. "It is too late to wander outside in an unfamiliar town. The house is completely locked now. I have thrown both bolts on the wooden door and the graveyard latch is secure. We are safe inside. Tomorrow morning, the very moment the government offices open, I will submit a formal application to the housing chairman. I will tell them the structure is unstable and unfit for a family, and we will find a small rental house in the main bazaar. Just give me this one night. We just have to get through until morning." Hira looked at me for a long time, searching my face for any sign of hesitation. Eventually, seeing that there was no viable alternative, she gave a slow, reluctant nod. She wiped her tears, but the terror in her eyes did not diminish. It simply settled into a quiet, desperate resignation. We decided to abandon the bedroom entirely. The proximity to that courtyard window was something our nerves could no longer handle. We dragged the heavy cotton mattress out into the small central dining area, placing it in the very middle of the room, as far away from the exterior windows and doors as possible. We turned on every single light fixture in the house, flooding the rooms with bright, harsh electrical light to banish even the smallest sliver of a shadow. By midnight, an unnatural, suffocating quiet settled over the colony. The regular sounds of the night, the distant bark of town dogs, the occasional rumble of a truck on the faraway main highway, seemed to stop completely, as if the world outside our walls had ceased to exist. The air inside the room grew progressively colder, a deep, bone-chilling cold that our heavy blankets could not seem to block out. Ayan fell into an uneasy, restless sleep, his small brow furrowed in a deep frown, his hands twitching occasionally against the sheets. Hira and I lay on either side of him, our eyes wide open, staring fixedly at the hallway that led toward the rear wooden door. It was exactly 2:14 a.m. when the final, horrifying climax of our ordeal began. The noise started without any warning. It wasn't a faint rustle or a distant step this time. It was a sudden, violent, and incredibly loud blow delivered directly against the ancient iron door of the graveyard. Bang! The heavy metallic impact echoed through the high-ceilinged rooms like a gunshot. The sound was so intense that the glass panes in the kitchen windows rattled violently in their frames. Hira let out a sharp gasp, instantly sitting up and pulling Ayan into her chest. The boy woke up immediately, his eyes wide with fear, but strangely he did not cry. He just sat perfectly still, staring toward the dark hallway with an expression of intense, knowing anticipation. Before I could even stand up or grab my wooden stick, a second blow struck the iron door. Bang! This time, the sound was immediately followed by a terrifying, horrific noise. It was the distinct, sharp sound of fingernails, or something sharp and solid, dragging slowly and forcefully down the rough, rusted surface of the metal door. It was a long, scraping screech that set our teeth on edge and sent a wave of pure, unfiltered dread straight down our spines. Then a voice drifted through the hallway, coming from the deep darkness of the rear courtyard. The voice was thin, reedy, and carried a strange, hollow echo, like a sound bouncing off the walls of a deep, empty water well. It belonged to a child, a young boy who sounded no older than Ayan. The words were spoken in a slow, rhythmic, sing-song cadence that felt completely devoid of human emotion. "Ayan, Ayan, come out, the lock is too high, I can't reach it. Open the door for me, Ayan." Hearing his name called from the darkness, Ayan's entire demeanor changed. The terror left his face, replaced by a blank, trance-like calm. He instantly pulled away from Hira's grip, his small body moving with an unnatural, fluid speed. He stood up from the mattress and began to walk directly toward the dark hallway, his eyes fixed on the wooden door, his small hands reaching out as if he was preparing to lift a latch. "No, Ayan, stop," I roared, my voice cracking as I leaped across the mattress. I grabbed him around his waist, pulling him back with force. The moment my hands touched his small body, I shocked to find that his skin felt ice cold to the touch, as if he had been standing outside in a winter freeze for hours. He didn't fight me. He didn't struggle. He just kept his eyes locked on the hallway, his face entirely expressionless. From the courtyard, the voice came again, its tone shifting slightly, becoming more urgent, sharper, and noticeably closer. It was no longer standing back by the cemetery wall. The sound was now coming from right outside the wooden door, just inches away from our living space. "Ayan, your Baba is holding you back. Tell him to let go. I want to show you my mud house. The earth is so soft here. Come out and play." Hira collapsed onto her knees on the mattress, her hands raised toward the ceiling, her voice rising in a loud, desperate and frantic recitation of Ayatul Kursi. She screamed the holy verses into the empty air, her tears flowing freely down her face. The moment the sacred words echoed through the house, the reaction from the outside was immediate and violent. The entity at the door let out a sharp, piercing, and unnaturally high-pitched shriek, a sound that was half human and half animal, filled with pure, unadulterated rage and malice. The wooden door began to shake violently within its frame, as if multiple heavy hands were slamming against the timber from the outside, trying to tear the hinges off the wall. Bang, bang, bang. The wood groaned under the immense pressure. I held Ayan tightly against my chest, using my own body as a shield, while my eyes darted around the brightly lit room. The light bulbs overhead suddenly began to flicker violently, their bright white light dimming down to a dull, amber glow before snapping back to full brightness. The air in the room became so cold that our breath began to form faint, white plumes of mist in front of our faces. For 20 agonizing minutes, the assault on the house continued without a single moment of rest. The scratching moved from the door to the bedroom window, the heavy sound of objects scraping against the brickwork echoing through the structure. Hira did not stop praying. She repeated the holy verses over and over, her voice growing hoarse but never losing its frantic intensity. I held our son with a death grip, praying with every fiber of my being for the night to end. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The heavy slamming ceased, the scratching vanished, and the piercing cold air seemed to lift from the room, flowing back toward the rear of the property. The light bulbs stopped flickering, burning with a steady, normal brightness once more. A vast, heavy, and natural silence returned to the colony. A few moments later, the distant, beautiful sound of the first Adhan for the Fajr prayer drifted through the morning air from a mosque in the main town. The moment the holy call to prayer echoed over the roofs, Ayan's body relaxed completely. The blank, vacant look left his eyes, and he instantly burst into a loud, trembling sob, turning into my chest and crying like a normal, frightened 5-year-old child. Hira crawled over to us, throwing her arms around both of us, and the three of us sat there on the floor bed, weeping silently in the relief of the morning light. We did not wait for the government offices to open. The very moment the sun was fully up, I walked down to the main road and hired a local loading vehicle. We packed our worldly possessions back into the truck with frantic, messy haste, not caring about neatness or order. We left the keys to the quarter with a neighbor in the front row, refusing to even walk back toward the administration block to hand them over to the clerk. We stayed in that government residential colony for exactly 3 days. Official convenience, financial pressure, and rent-free housing are all important factors in a practical life, but we learned a hard truth during those 72 hours. For a house to be a home, a low rent is never enough. A person's heart must feel at peace within its walls. On the 4th day, I rented a small, basic house in the crowded, noisy heart of the main bazaar. It was more expensive, and it strained our modest budget, but it was surrounded by the comforting, mundane noise of living people. In the years that followed, many colleagues at the office made light of our sudden move. Some laughed, saying the new officer had grown terrified of a simple graveyard. Others claimed it was merely the typical imagination of a family's first night in an old, creaking building. I never corrected them, and I never shared the full details of that night with anyone. I do not claim to know exactly what was standing outside our door, whether it was a restless spirit, a dark shadow, an optical illusion of our exhausted minds, or simply the heavy, accumulated sorrow of an old house that had absorbed too much grief over the decades. I only know that some borders are meant to remain closed. The immediate morning after our escape from that cursed row of quarters was spent in a blur of frantic survival. Moving our belongings into the small, cramped rental house in the middle of the bustling main bazaar felt like crossing over from a frozen wasteland into a warm, sunlit room. The noise of the market outside, the shouting of fruit vendors, the constant honking of motorcycles, the hum of human voices, acted like a thick blanket, insulating our frayed nerves from the terrifying silence we had left behind. For the first week, we tried our best to immerse ourselves in the exhausting routine of setting up a new household. Hira spent her days arranging the kitchen, hanging brightly colored curtains over the windows, and keeping the house filled with the comforting aromas of fresh cooking. I went to my office every morning, forcing myself to focus on the mindless stacks of government files, answering my colleagues' teasing remarks about my fear of graveyards with a forced, silent nod. We wanted desperately to believe that the horror had been left behind on that dusty plot of land by the boundary wall. We wanted to believe that by physically moving our bodies, we had broken the tether to whatever entity had called out to our son in the dead of night. But a week into our new life, the comforting illusion of safety began to crack. The first sign appeared not in the dead of night, but during the bright, clear hours of a Sunday afternoon. The bazaar outside was unusually quiet, as most shops were closed for the weekend. Hira was in the courtyard, washing clothes in a plastic tub, and I was sitting on a charpai in the small veranda, reading the weekend newspaper. Ayan was sitting just a few feet away from me, playing with the same plastic cars he had been arranging on that terrifying first night. Suddenly, without any warning, Ayan stopped moving his toys. He sat perfectly still on the concrete floor, his head tilted at an awkward, rigid angle, as if he was straining his ears to catch a sound that was completely beyond my reach. I looked up from my newspaper, a sudden familiar prickle of alertness hitting the back of my neck. "Ayan, what is it, Beta? Why did you stop playing?" The boy did not answer me immediately. He remained frozen for several long seconds. Then, very slowly, he turned his small face toward the interior of the house, not toward the street outside, but toward the dark, narrow hallway that connected our small sitting room to the back washroom. He raised his small, trembling finger and pointed directly at the empty, shadowed corner of the corridor. "Baba," he whispered, his voice incredibly flat, lacking any of the natural warmth of a 5-year-old child. "He found us." My heart took a violent leap against my ribs. I dropped the newspaper, stood up instantly, and walked over to him, casting a sharp, searching look down the hallway. The corridor was completely empty. The bright afternoon sun was streaming through the open courtyard sky, illuminating the concrete walls clearly. There was no shadow, no hidden figure, no intruder. I bent down, grabbing Ayan gently by his shoulders, forcing him to look away from the dark corner and into my eyes. "There is no one there, Ayan," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound firm. "Look at the sun. We are in the main bazaar now. The old house is far away. No one can come here." Ayan looked at me, his eyes wide and completely vacant, reflecting that same terrifying trance-like calm that had gripped him during the climax of our final night at the quarter. He didn't cry. He just spoke in a quiet, matter-of-fact whisper that chilled me to the bone. "He didn't walk here on the road, Baba. He told me he travels through the dirt. He said the earth under this floor is connected to the earth over there." Before I could form a response, Hira rushed into the veranda, her hands still dripping with soapy water. She had heard Ayan's voice, and the expression on her face was a mixture of pure terror and maternal fury. She snatched Ayan up from the floor, pulling him tightly into her chest, her body trembling as she glared at the empty hallway as if she could see the invisible threat standing there. That evening, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere we thought we had escaped returned to our lives with absolute finality. The bright, noisy bazaar outside no longer felt like a shield. Instead, it felt like a fragile, thin stage set, behind which a dark, patient reality was quietly waiting for the sun to go down. We decided that we could no longer sleep separate from our son, nor could we leave any corner of the house in darkness. We kept every single light fixture burning throughout the night. But as the clock ticked past midnight, an unnatural, deep cold began to seep into the rooms. It was that same bone-chilling, damp cold we had experienced at the quarter, a freezing draft that carried the distinct, unmistakable odor of rotting autumn leaves and wet, freshly dug earth. At exactly 3:00 a.m., the first physical disturbance occurred in our new home. Hira and I were lying awake on either side of Ayan, our eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Suddenly, a low, rhythmic sound began to vibrate through the concrete floor bed. It wasn't a sound coming from the street or from the neighboring roofs. It was coming from directly beneath our mattress. Thump, thumpy, thumpy. It was a dull, heavy sound, exactly like someone striking the underside of the concrete floor with a solid, blunt object. The vibrations were distinct, traveling straight through the bedding and into our bodies. With every dull impact, the tiny night lamp in the corner of the room would flicker violently, its weak light dimming down to a pinpoint before snapping back. I sat up straight, my breathing shallow, my hand reaching instinctively for the wooden stick I had kept by the bed. Beside me, Hira gripped my arm with a terrifying, vice-like strength. Her lips were moving rapidly, her voice a frantic, desperate whisper as she began reciting verses of protection into the dark. The thumping beneath the floor stopped for a brief, tense minute. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. And then, a new sound broke the quiet, a sound that made our blood run completely cold. It was the distinct, sharp sound of something dragging across the rough concrete of our small interior courtyard outside the bedroom door. It sounded exactly like a heavy, wet object being pulled slowly over the ground, leaving a dragging trail behind it. The sound moved with an agonizing, calculated slowness, starting from the back washroom area, moving along the wall, and coming to a dead stop right outside our wooden bedroom door. Then, through the thin gap beneath the door, a low, reedy voice drifted into the room. It was that same hollow, childlike echo we had heard at the cemetery wall, but now it sounded deeper, more distorted, and filled with a mocking, patient malice. "Ayan, Ayan, your new house is so small. There is no room to play here. Come back to the wall. The mud house is waiting for you. It's so quiet under the trees." Ayan's eyes snapped open the moment the voice called his name. He did not cry out in fear. Instead, he sat up with that same unnatural, fluid speed, his small body completely rigid. He turned his head toward the door, his chest heaving with short, rapid breaths, and he whispered back into the darkness, "I am coming." "No," Hira screamed, throwing her entire weight over our son, pinning him down to the mattress with her arms. She wrapped her body around him like a shield, screaming the holy words of Ayatal Kursi at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking and tearing with pure, unfiltered desperation. I leaped off the bed, my mind pushed past the brink of rational control by pure fear and anger. I grabbed the wooden stick, threw the internal bolt on the bedroom door, and yanked it open, determined to face whatever human or inhuman tormentor was standing in our home. The small interior courtyard was completely bathed in the harsh white light of our outdoor bulb. There was no physical form standing there. The space was entirely empty. But as I shone the bright beam of my phone torch down toward the concrete floor, my knees turned weak, and the wooden stick nearly slipped from my frozen fingers. There, leading from the dark corner of the hallway all the way to the threshold of our bedroom door, was a thick, damp trail of wet black mud. It wasn't regular dirt. It was a heavy, clay-like soil mixed with tiny fragments of decaying, brittle leaves and small, white pieces of crushed limestone, the exact composition of the ancient earth found within the deep sections of the old town graveyard. The trail was fresh, the moisture glistening under the harsh glare of the electrical light, looking exactly as if a heavy, mud-soaked form had dragged itself across our clean floor before vanishing into thin air the moment the door was opened. I stood there in the freezing courtyard air, my chest heaving, looking at that physical evidence of the unexplainable. The sounds of Hira's frantic prayers echoed out from the bedroom behind me, a desperate wall of sound fighting against the heavy, stagnant silence of the night. We were no longer dealing with a haunted building or an old, creaking structure. The border had not just been crossed, it had been entirely erased. Whatever entity had chosen our son from across that ancient brick wall was no longer bound by geography. It had followed us into the heart of the living world, and it was quietly, persistently digging its way into our lives. The terrifying evidence on our courtyard floor shattered the final remains of my skepticism. We were no longer fighting a haunted location. We were in a desperate battle for the soul and life of our only child. The heavy, clay-like graveyard mud drying on our floor was a physical declaration of war from an entity that refused to let go. The rest of that night was spent in a state of absolute, breathless terror. Hira did not stop reciting holy verses until her voice completely gave out, leaving her whispering the sacred words in a dry, hoarse rasp. I sat by the bedroom door with the heavy wooden stick resting across my knees, my eyes wide and bloodshot, staring fixedly at the dark stain on the floor outside. Ayan lay between us, his small body perfectly still, but his breathing was unnaturally shallow, and his skin maintained that terrifying, icy chill that no amount of blankets could warm. When the sun finally rose over the crowded roofs of the main bazaar, its bright light did not bring the comforting relief it had brought before. The daytime felt like nothing more than a temporary ceasefire, a brief period of light where the entity was forced to pull back its shadows, only to bide its time until the darkness returned. I knew we could not survive another night like the last one. My son was slipping away from us, his consciousness tethered to a voice that traveled through the very earth beneath our feet, desperate for a solution that logic could no longer provide. I decided to seek help outside the bureaucratic world of government offices. I remembered a senior colleague at my office, a respected elder named Uncle Farouk, who had lived in this tehsil for his entire life and knew the history of every old family, every plot of land, and every corner of the district. During the lunch break, I closed the door to my office, sat down across from Uncle Farouk and told him everything. I omitted nothing: the ancient iron door at the government quarter, the parted leaves in the backyard, the sing-song voice calling my son's name, and the terrifying trail of graveyard mud that had appeared inside our new home in the bazaar. As I spoke, the casual, relaxed expression on Uncle Farouk's weathered face vanished completely. He listened in absolute silence, his eyes fixed on his desk, his hands tightening around his teacup until his knuckles turned white. When I finally finished my account, my chest heaving with suppressed emotion, he let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Adnan," he began, his voice dropping to a low, cautious whisper. "You did the right thing by running away from that row of quarters, but you must understand that what you are dealing with is not a simple shadow tied to a building. That old town graveyard is ancient, dating back to before the partition of the subcontinent. And that specific row of government quarters was built on land that was forcefully taken from the cemetery perimeter during an administrative expansion 30 years ago." He leaned in closer, his eyes filled with a grim, absolute seriousness. 20 years ago, a clerk from the irrigation department was allotted that exact same quarter at the end of the line. He had a young son, a boy named Samir, who was around 6 years old. The boy was an innocent, happy child, but he began complaining to his mother that a little friend would come to the iron door at night, asking him to come out and play in the mud. The parents dismissed it as childish imagination, a simple reaction to living next to a cemetery. A cold dread settled deep in my stomach as Uncle Farouk continued his story. One night, during a heavy monsoon rainstorm, the parents awoke in the dead of night to find the rear wooden door wide open and the iron graveyard latch pulled back. They rushed out into the pouring rain with lanterns, searching the muddy pathways of the cemetery for hours. It was right before the Fajr Adhan when they finally found him. The young boy had dragged himself deep into the old section of the graveyard, near the roots of an ancient, sprawling shisham tree. He was buried up to his chest in a freshly collapsed, muddy hollow of the earth, his small hands still clutching the wet soil. By the time they pulled him out, the cold had taken him. He was gone. Uncle Farouk placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my trembling shoulder. The family left the town the very next day, and the quarter remained sealed for years until it was cleared and assigned to you. The entity you are facing is an asterisk jinnat of the wilderness, a dark presence that has inhabited that old earth for generations. It mimics the form and voice of a child to lure the innocent across the border of the living. It doesn't want to haunt a house, Adnan. It wants a companion for the dark earth. It has chosen Ayan, and because his young mind responded to its call on that first night, a spiritual connection was formed. It will follow him wherever he goes in this town, digging through the soil beneath any structure until that connection is broken. "How do we break it?" I gasped, my voice cracking with pure desperation. "Tell me what to do, Uncle. I will do anything to save my son." Uncle Farouk looked at me with deep sympathy. "You cannot fight this force with iron bolts, moving houses, or physical weapons. You must cut the tie completely and seek refuge in the ultimate protection of the Almighty. Tonight is Friday night. Take your family, leave this tehsil immediately, and go back to your ancestral village or a major city where the earth has no connection to this ancient soil. Before you leave, you must perform a specific act of charity and spiritual closure." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a clean envelope containing a substantial amount of money, and handed it to me. "Take this, combine it with whatever savings you have, and go to the old mosque near the main bazaar. Give it to the administrator for the care of orphan children. Then go back to your house, sit with Hira, and both of you must place your hands on Ayan's head. Recite the Surah al-Baqarah completely aloud in the rooms, letting the sacred words saturate the walls and your son's consciousness. When you finish, do not look back, do not pack your things, and do not spend another hour in this town. Just leave." I took his advice with the absolute desperation of a drowning man. I left the office immediately, handed over the charity at the mosque, and rushed back to our rental house. Hira and I didn't care about our furniture, our clothes, or the financial loss of abandoning our security deposit. We sat on the mattress in the center of the brightly lit room, our hands trembling as we placed them firmly on Ayan's cold head. Together, our voices rose in a unified, powerful recitation of the holy verses. As the words filled the room, the house began to react. The unnatural, freezing cold air descended upon us once more, a deep frost that made our muscles stiffen. From beneath the concrete floor, a frantic, violent scratching sound broke out, exactly like multiple sharp claws desperately tearing at the underside of the foundation, trying to break through the stone to reach our child. The light bulbs overhead flickered violently, casting chaotic, dancing shadows across the white walls. Ayan's body stiffened, his lips moving silently as if he was fighting against an invisible pull trying to drag his mind back into the dark. But we did not stop. We poured every ounce of our parental love, faith, and desperation into the sacred words, raising our voices until they drowned out the terrifying sounds from beneath the earth. For hours, the spiritual battle raged within the small room. And then, as we reached the final verses of the surah, a sudden, explosive sound echoed through the house, a sharp crack like a lightning strike hitting the structure. The violent scratching beneath the floor stopped instantly, replaced by a distant, fatting shriek of pure rage that seemed to sink deep into the earth, moving further and further away until it vanished completely. The oppressive, suffocating weight lifted from our chests. The light bulb stabilized into a steady, warm glow, and a deep, natural warmth rushed back into the room. We looked down at our son. The deathly pale gray tint had left his face, replaced by a healthy, warm flush. He opened his eyes, and for the first time in days, the blank, vacant stare was entirely gone. His eyes were bright, clear, and filled with the beautiful, innocent light of a normal 5-year-old boy. He looked up at the two of us, a gentle smile breaking across his small face, and said in his normal, warm voice, "Baba, Mama, I am so hungry. Can we have some food?" Hira burst into tears of pure, overwhelming joy, pulling him into an intense, crushing embrace. We did not wait another minute. We left our worldly possessions sitting in that empty rental house, walked out to the main bazaar road, and caught the very first air-conditioned bus heading out of the district toward Lahore. As the bus rattled down the highway, moving further and further away from the remote Tehsil and the ancient boundary wall of the dead, I looked out the window at the disappearing landscape. I felt an incredible, profound sense of gratitude wash over me. 6 years have passed since that terrifying ordeal. We never returned to that town, and I resigned from that specific government posting, preferring the financial hardship of a lower-tier job in a bustling city over the darkness we had encountered. Ayan is now 11 years old, a healthy, happy and thriving young boy who has no memory of the terrifying events of his childhood. The spiritual connection was broken that night, cut clean by the power of faith and parental devotion. I have chosen to share this story now not to spread fear, but to offer a serious, lasting reminder to everyone who listens. In our modern, practical lives, we often look at the world through the lens of convenience, finances, and material comfort. We ignore the ancient warnings, treating the boundaries between the living and the dead as simple geographical lines on a map. But the unseen world is real, patient, and bound by laws that human convenience cannot alter. Some doors are meant to remain locked, some calls should never be answered, and some borders must never be crossed. May Allah protect our homes. Guard our innocent children from every creeping evil, every dark presence that wanders through the waste spaces, and every hidden call that echoes out from the shadows of the world. Amen.